Hello and welcome to the Flyover Libertarian, episode 14. Today we're talking to Dribly, a Twitter user that knows a lot about Bitcoin. We've talked to Dribly before, but Bitcoin's been in the news again lately, so let's see what's going on. We've got PayPal legitimizing Bitcoin, and then JP Morgan Chase legitimizing Bitcoin. Is that as big a deal as CNBC makes it out to be?
If you are one of the people who follows CNBC, which is to say, on Bitcoin Twitter, there are two factions, if you will, that I follow. They kind of blend into each other. But there's the people who are in it to get rich, or perhaps the number go up crew. And those people are stoked that PayPal's involved, that JP Morgan is involved, that they talk about this on CNBC. Because as purely an investment vehicle, yes, this is huge news. PayPal giving people access is just mind-blowing when you consider the number of people who use PayPal on a daily basis. The other group is not so much interested in this. And that's what more of the technical side, more of the political people, the libertarians, the ANCAPs and such, who are more interested in what Bitcoin stands for and what it can do. And actually, what PayPal is offering people could be a net detriment to Bitcoin because of the way that it's set up. So with Bitcoin, with PayPal, which is actually the same thing as with Robinhood, the investing app, it allows a person to purchase Bitcoin in the app, but they can't do anything with it except sell it later. They can't use it for commerce. They can't buy. They can't send it anywhere. They can't receive Bitcoin. So functionally, what they're buying from PayPal is an IOU, and they are trusting that PayPal actually has the Bitcoins. And when they come to want to sell their Bitcoins through PayPal, they are trusting that PayPal will give them what the current exchange rate is. And yeah, PayPal's got its policies in place, but there's really no guarantee of that, simply because PayPal is, at that point, a trusted third party. First off, you don't actually know whether or not they have any Bitcoin. They're just telling you that they do. Second off, you don't know if they're going to give it to you when you want it back. And so this gets into the Bitcoin meme, which is not your keys, not your Bitcoins, which really is true. If you don't own the private keys, if you don't have control of the private keys for the Bitcoins, they're not yours. Somebody else owns them, and you have an IOU, and you're destroying the very fundamental part about Bitcoin, which is there are no trusted intermediaries. And so if you need to trust PayPal, or if you need to trust JP Morgan, or if you need to trust Robinhood, I mean, you're not doing Bitcoin. You are investing to make money.
Are you expecting that every normal person in the future should learn basics of cryptography and Bitcoin and private keys in the same way that every person that wants to work in an office now needs to understand Microsoft Office? Like, it's just something you have to adapt to be useful because this is the new tool?
I would think so.
Because that's the argument against it, is that so many people just don't understand cryptography, so how can you expect them to understand Bitcoin? But you're expecting there's a basic level of literacy for cryptocurrency that you're expecting in the future it will be a standard if you want to transact.
For the most part, I think it's actually more equivalent to email, where people know how to send an email. They know how to create a Gmail account. And they can do it. But then if you want to send encrypted emails, that's additional learning that you don't have to do to use email. If you want to host your own mail server, that's additional learning that you don't have to do to do email. So in this case, Google is a trusted third party. However much you trust them, they are hosting your data. They are taking care of it. And functionally speaking, we have a decent court system currently in America. So, like, the data that's on their servers is your data. Um, but if you want to go off the deep end, you can, at which point nobody hosts your data, nobody hosts your emails except you. Nobody can read them except you because they're all encrypted. Um, and it's more of that where for the average person, um, using Gmail is just fine. There's really no reason for them to not, simply because it works. It's simple. It's easy. Um, and it's just very, very convenient. For the people who need it otherwise, let's say you have some journalist hiding out under some regime trying to expose the truth. They're not going to use Gmail. They're not going to use Hotmail. They're going to use some method of encryption, use some method of hiding their internet traffic in order to expose what's going on. And so that person will need to know how to utilize these systems more effectively in order to perform their job. And then there are also the people who create the systems like Gmail that work really easily. Those people have to know what they're doing. And so right now you can go to any app store, you can go to the Play Store, download a Bitcoin wallet. I can send you Bitcoins, you can send me Bitcoins, we can send them to Iran. And you don't know what's going on underneath because you don't have to, because the wallet takes care of that, because the people who created the wallet know how it works and they took care of it for you.
Sure. In that case, they still have access to their private keys, but they still don't understand what a private key is.
Right. And so at some point there's some amount of trust in a third party unless you compile the code yourself. And for most people, they aren't technically capable of that. Bitcoin creates a system where if somebody were to put in the work, they could compile their own wallet. Heck, they could write their own wallet. They can download the Bitcoin blockchain. They can verify every single transaction in the history of Bitcoin.
And that's really more important than each person doing it themselves. Just the fact that it can be verified.
The fact that it can be done. However, more people doing that means that it is more censorship resistant.
It's kind of like open source code. I'll deploy some more open source code all the time for projects and hobbies and be like, this could be a virus. I probably isn't though, because it's got a whole bunch of contributors on GitHub.
Right.
So
exactly.
I'm just gonna install this. It's probably fine.
It's probably fine. And for most people, taking open source software and just putting it on blindly without being able to read the code is fine, simply because it's open source. And you can trust the system. And so you can download. I highly recommend downloading the Bitcoin Core. That's the most common computer-based Bitcoin node that you can run. It's also a Bitcoin wallet. Gives you great coin control. Download it. Start downloading the blockchain. And then your computer is verifying every single transaction so that the Bitcoins that are in your wallet you know are yours. You know they're not fake. Even if you don't know how the code actually works, because thousands and thousands of people have reviewed it and you can trust the system itself.
When companies like PayPal and Robinhood get involved in Bitcoin, does that threaten the decentralized network or the decentralized nature of Bitcoin when large companies like, for example, Square invested $50 million into Bitcoin, like they purchased $15 million worth of Bitcoin
a month ago,
in October, I guess?
It can. Individual companies holding it, I think in my opinion, is okay, because that's the market. The company has decided for whatever reason, they would rather be in Bitcoin than in whatever their native currency is. And that's just the market at play. They've weighed their risks, they've weighed their potential rewards, and they've decided we're going to invest this much of my money into these many Bitcoins. The big issue for me actually is what looks to be the same, is like ETFs or investment firms, JP Morgan, all these online exchanges that hold Bitcoins for people who really have no idea what it's about. And they're just in it for the financial exposure. At that point, that company might be custodying thousands and thousands, tens or hundreds of thousands of Bitcoins, at which point they could potentially have a fair amount of clout in the network.
More than just what they would purchase on their own is the important point there. They've got a pool of Bitcoin that's more than just what they would have purchased on their own.
And whoever owns the keys controls those Bitcoins. Now, at the end of the day, it's actually the nodes who control Bitcoin, which is why it is imperative that anybody who uses Bitcoin runs a node, because the nodes are the ones who enforce the rules. Any node operator can decide which rules that node wants to enforce, and then they get to enforce those rules. And so even if, going back to, like, let's say JP Morgan has 100,000 Bitcoins, they are regulatory bound by their government, which is the US, and they have to follow all those rules. Whereas you and I don't. We are not, registered money service businesses. We are not bound by KYC regulations. And so the network is much more anonymous, much more resilient when it's used by the small people. And so JP Morgan, let's say the US government puts in a rule that says anybody who uses Bitcoin has to know the identity of the person sending them Bitcoins. JP Morgan will have to follow that, or they will get shut down as a company. You and I don't have to. I mean, it would be illegal, and I'm absolutely, of course, not advocating that anybody do anything illegal ever. But the government might not know. And so it's the small guys, it's the individual nodes who choose the rules that they want to enforce, and then enforce them. If I wanted to create a node that had 22 million Bitcoins instead of the 21 that exists right now, I can do that. Nobody's stopping me, but I can't force a single person to come along with me on that. Yeah. And so it is the ultimate in rules without rulers, where we have the best possible democratic society where things are generally elected by popularity. But at any point, if anybody wants to say, no, I'm not interested in this, they can leave, and nobody's able to force them to stay. And that may not be true for the big companies who have lots of Bitcoins that they're custodying for other people.
Sure. So the control issue and the decentralization issue and the 51% rule issue isn't so much about the actual Bitcoins, it's about the nodes. In the same way, like criticisms have been made about regular stock equity ETFs, where these companies are just holding billions and billions of dollars worth of stock as an ETF. Like you said, like a Bitcoin ETF is an issue because they have access to more Bitcoin than they normally would just purchase. A lot of these companies have way, way, way more stock than they would just because people are putting it into an index fund. In the same way, that's an issue because they actually get the voting rights. So your brokerage gets the voting rights on those shares. You could think of the Bitcoin node as like the voting rights, the actual control of the system.
For all these people who feel like they own Bitcoin, they don't. They just own exposure to the current exchange rate of Bitcoin. They don't own their private keys, and most likely they're not running a node. Where if they're trusting somebody else to hold their Bitcoins, there's no way that they're going to be running a node. So that person is not participating in the network. That person is not enforcing the rule set that they want enforced. And so it can create a much, much weaker system.
Sure.
Yeah, the other one I wanted to talk about, the other company, is called MicroStrategy. They're a publicly traded company that I think very, very high level. They are a software as a service company, and they just work with tech companies. In August and September, they purchased a total of 38,250 Bitcoins, and they paid a total price of $250 million for it. And I haven't watched a whole lot of the CEO's interviews and such, but essentially the guy is saying that he doesn't trust the US dollar long term, and he does trust Bitcoin long term, and he decided to put half of his company's cash reserves into Bitcoin. Since that, their $425 million is currently worth about $510 million. So almost $100 million that they've made in 3 months, which is more than 3.5 years, the last 3.5 years of their net profits. And so I think you will see more and more companies whether or not they agree with Bitcoin's ethos, gaining exposure to Bitcoin simply because they come to believe they can't afford to not. They might put 2%, they might put 0.5% of their cash reserves into Bitcoin on the off chance that it goes up.
Yeah, this isn't just some no-name startup either. This has been around since 1989. This is like a established firm that's like, we can't afford not to do this.
And so kind of by extension, their stock is in some way a Bitcoin ETF at this point, because the value of their stock is going to be somewhat tied to the price of Bitcoin going forward. They've already made over 25% return on their investment, and assuming Bitcoin's price still goes up, that's gonna go up as well. Their stock price has gone up. It was about 150 or so, 140 when they announced their first purchase in August, and last I checked, it was almost 180. I was hoping to get some of it when they first announced it, but I wasn't quick enough for it. And so some person who's got a traditional 401k or Roth IRA or something, who doesn't want to transfer it over and directly buy Bitcoins with it, can choose to purchase the stock of companies that publicly acknowledge that they own Bitcoin as kind of a second or third hop away from some sort of Bitcoin ETF.
When did they announce this?
MicroStrategy, I don't know the exact date. It was in August, though.
Okay.
And it was like a doozy. They bought 25,000, something like that, maybe closer to 30, and like nobody was expecting it. They just had a public announcement one day. Hey guys, we bought a crap load of Bitcoin, and we think it's cool. So there's a website, bitcointreasuries.org, that people can go to. This is where I got most of my information about these companies. It lists publicly known public and private companies that own Bitcoin, when they bought it, news articles related to it, how much they own and such. It's run by a Twitter personality known as NVK, who makes the best hardware wallets that are out there. So I highly recommend you check out the website and NVK's stuff, CoinKite. I think it's coinkite.com. Let me pull that up real quick to see.
I like the idea of investing in companies anchored with Bitcoin. So I want, I'm young, I'm not approaching retirement. I want to invest in equities, particularly tech companies. That's just how people our age skew. But whenever I know their value is anchored by an asset that can't be diluted.
Just imagine if there was a company out there that only allowed people to purchase its stock in some number of ounces of gold. A tenth of an ounce or a full ounce or whatever. That's the only way they would sell you their stock. Then the value of that company is directly tied to the price of gold. I should say the price of that company is directly tied to the price of gold. And this is the same situation where now MicroStrategy's stock valuation will go up in some correlation with the price of Bitcoin going up. So, I mean, if Bitcoin goes 100x, which is a number people like to throw around because it's a round number, that means then all of a sudden Square's Bitcoin will be worth 10% of its market cap. I'm not much of a betting man, so I'm not going to tell you what the odds are of Bitcoin going 100x, but I know they're less than 100% and greater than 0.
Yeah, it's been surprisingly stable like the last couple of years, and I feel like that legitimized it, especially when there's so much like potential for inflation in the next year. I feel like that legitimized it, just the fact that everybody said it was a joke and acted like it wasn't going to do anything, and then it's just stable for a couple of years.
Yeah, so during the big run-up in late 2017, everybody heard about Bitcoin. And then most people heard about Bitcoin when it was $15,000 to $20,000, and then they saw it drop down to $3,000 over the course of 12 to 18 months, and they're like, "This is something I won't touch with a 10-foot pole." And then it stopped going down, and then it just kind of hibernated for a while, and people forgot about it. And then 2020 hit, and then the world shut down, and now we have money printers in every country, and people are starting to realize, well, all these nuts who are talking about money printing or talking about inflation, they might actually know what they're talking about. And then just recently, Bitcoin hit over 3 months of being worth more than 10,000 US dollars, which is the longest it has ever been above that. And people are like, wait a minute, it's stabilizing. And over the last month, it's gone up like 20%. And people are like, wait a minute, it's stabilized, found a bottom, now it's going up, and it can't be diluted, it can't be inflated away. And the U.S. government has pretty much promised to print however much money they need to do whatever they want.
They literally
and
promised,
they're like, maybe I want to look into something else. And then on top of that, you get these. First off, it's the crazy tech companies. You get MicroStrategy, you get Square saying, hey, we're exposed to Bitcoin because we think it's cool. And then you get JP Morgan and you get PayPal saying, all right, people, anybody who uses PayPal, come, you can buy some Bitcoin. And then...
Yeah, so the reasons are a little bit different there, right? Like JP Morgan is like, oh, this is the new gold. So we're going to hold this because young people are treating it like the new gold, so we're going to call it the new gold.
PayPal just wants to not fade into oblivion because there are now all these other alternative U.S. dollar based.
Yeah, and they're an old company too. You know, they bought Venmo because they were about to lose relevancy.
Right. One of the guys who's big into Bitcoin right now, and I forget his name. I think it's Peter something, but don't quote me on that. Was in the original team that created PayPal, and he said that Bitcoin is what they wanted to create when they started PayPal. That PayPal was was too centralized, so therefore too regulatable, and therefore they couldn't implement what they saw. And so PayPal, they just needed something, and so I think that's why they did it. But now, if you think about it, JP Morgan and PayPal are what? Top 20 at worst financially related companies in the world. And now they've said Bitcoin is at least legitimate enough for us to be exposed to it. And so every single medium-sized bank right now is going, holy smokes, how do we get caught up on this? We don't want to be left in the dust. Every single publicly traded company that's remotely technically is saying to itself, well, do we want to put in 1% of our market cap? Do we want 5%? Do we want to pull a MicroStrategy and throw in half our money? So from a purely supply and demand price perspective, the demand is coming, and Bitcoin supply is not going to go any faster. And when demand increases and supply remains the same, the price has to go up. And so the people who are very excited about the money are very, very excited right now. Because if you look at the stock chart, we have a pretty classic bottom and starting a move up. If you look at the world around it, we have unprecedented inflation, we have unprecedented unrest, we have unprecedented government overreach, and we have companies left and right saying, hey, I'm into Bitcoin as well. And it just seems to be the perfect storm that's leading towards Bitcoin's favor. And I really think the next 12 to 18 months are going to be quite the ride. Again, from a purely financial standpoint, it makes me a little nervous from the technical side, but I can't do much more than run my own node and see what happens.
You could run more nodes.
I could run more nodes. That's true. I don't have that much time. We'll get to the Iran topic pretty quick. But if this goes down, one potential response to the Iran topic, it could be that every company in America is required to fight against Bitcoin because of government regulation. So your internet service provider...
So they extend the sanctions to port 8333?
At that point, it will drive everything underground. They will have to go onto a VPN at least. They'll have to go to Tor. But then, this is the coolest thing ever. You can get the Bitcoin network via satellite. You can buy a kit, or you can buy a dish satellite off Craigslist and build your own computer that does it. But there is a company, again, trusted third party, but there is a company that has created a satellite network that sends and receives transactions via satellite.
Amazing. Wow.
And so if your internet service provider cuts you off, either completely or just the Bitcoin traffic, well, then you just pop on your satellite.
Technically, you could do it over AM radio if you had to. It's literally just data.
Right. So you can do it over ham radio. You can do it over light signals. You can print a transaction up on a billboard. It's very easy to see where things could get very bad very quickly, and all of this will go underground. But there's no way in my mind to see how this is going to stop completely, because
it doesn't stop.
It's only a matter of time until a government comes out and says we are using Bitcoin to sidestep international policies that we don't like. And here we get
Isn't that what Iran just
And here we get
did?
to Iran. Exactly.
Yeah.
So this just happened, just was announced today, where Iran said that they will be utilizing Bitcoin for imports as a way to sidestep U.S. economic sanctions. So I'm not obviously an expert on Iran's law or international import and export, but my understanding of it is, and I can send you a couple links on this that you can post, that the people in Iran who are mining Bitcoin, to some extent, are doing so with government-subsidized electricity, because the government is subsidizing it for the purpose of buying the Bitcoins from the miners so that the government can use it for import of goods. So if you're a miner in Iran, if I understand this correctly, you are required to sell some of your Bitcoin to the government, and that is in exchange for the right to be allowed to mine Bitcoin. And right now, Iran, I think, has about 4 or 5% of the hash rate, which is significant. That's a lot. And so Iran has publicly stated, the U.S. economic sanctions are crippling our economy. There are people dying. The actual Iranian money is in like 35% inflation right now. So it's just being decimated. And it's because of these economic sanctions, and people are dying.
It's amazing. It's so powerful as a currency that a state is literally turning away from their inflated currency to use this instead.
And so, in the course of a week or two, we've had PayPal, we've had JP Morgan, and now we have a country. There's a good chance that the next country to do this will either be Venezuela or North Korea. Just to take a little rabbit trail, it's the give me a second. It's the oppressed countries that will turn to Bitcoin first. And Venezuela and North Korea are oppressed because of what they have done. I'm well aware that they are. It is a self-inflicted oppression. But they will view themselves as the victims of the U.S. aggression, and they will look for ways to get around, regardless of who's at fault. They will try to find ways to get around it. In the past, they would have had to go to gold, and now they just go online, and they will utilize Bitcoin. And there will be nothing that any government is going to be able to do to stop it. And the moment that so going from 0 to 1 is a significant event. We now have one country publicly using Bitcoins. There are more out there that just haven't made it public yet. But now that Iran has done it, well, now countries are a little more willing to consider publicly announcing it. Obviously, the U.S., the UK, they're not going to do it because that would associate them with Iran. But maybe another Mideast country will publicly announce, hey, we use Bitcoin too. Maybe Russia will. And eventually it'll reach a point where you will end up, countries will join not because they care about being associated with Iran, not because they might not even care about Bitcoin, but they don't want to be the last one. It will be a snowball where every single country will say, yeah, we'll utilize Bitcoins for international commerce or for debt payments. And then what happens to the ability of the U.S. to force its decisions onto other countries because of the fact that the U.S. is the global reserve currency? It goes away. And then the U.S. has to actually economically compete with other countries on an international scale. And it's just kind of exciting to realize that this could be the watershed moment where it's all downhill from here. Might take 10 years, might take 100. I don't know. But I really don't think there's any way for any country, including the U.S., to stop it at this point.
It reminded me of when FDR confiscated gold. How if you I'm sure it's a lot easier to confiscate gold when your gold is actually stored somewhere else in a bank or something. If you've actually got control of it in your own house or basement, then it can't actually be taken if they don't know about it. So in the same way, you need to control your own private keys.
You need to control your own private keys, but in this case, it is imperative that you obtain the Bitcoin itself in a completely anonymous fashion.
Sure, because if you're just transferring it from Coinbase,
then they know, or the Cash App, which is a derivative of Square, which is owned by Jack Dorsey, which is a great app. I bought quite a bit of Bitcoin through the Cash App, but that is KYC'd Bitcoin. Functionally speaking, it's tainted. And if the government ever wanted to issue Order 6102, which was the one for gold, if they ever want to do that again against Bitcoin, they know how much Bitcoin I have purchased. And they can come and say, what have you done with this Bitcoin? And my assumption is if I can't adequately say this is what I did with my Bitcoin, I will be in very big trouble because they will then get to assume that I bought drugs and hitmen. So at the very least, if you buy Bitcoins, you have to if you buy Bitcoins via KYC, you have to look into a way of mixing them, so at least they're anonymized, but that doesn't stop the government from knowing that you had them in the first place. The best way to obtain Bitcoin safely is to obtain it completely anonymously, and there are really three options. One is to buy it anonymously, which is really hard nowadays. Some Bitcoin ATMs let you buy anonymously. Some people who have Bitcoin may be willing to sell it to you anonymously. The option number 2 is to work for it. So you provide a good or a service and somebody pays you in Bitcoins. And then option number 3 is to mine it, where you mine Bitcoins and they get sent to you completely anonymously. One thing to be very, very careful of then at that point is if you have Bitcoins that are tied to your identity, they can never be used in the same transaction as Bitcoins that are not tied to your identity. Otherwise, you destroy the privacy of those Bitcoins. So, like if I have, let's say, a quarter of a Bitcoin that is the government knows is owned by Andy Ott, and I need to buy something for, let's say, half a Bitcoin, I can take a quarter Bitcoin of my, anonymous Bitcoins. But if I use that quarter Bitcoin that's tied to my identity, both of them are known to be tied to me. And so, yeah, if you want to avoid the repeat of the FDR situation, you have to have your own keys and you have to have obtained the Bitcoins anonymously. Yeah, so I got a couple links about the Iran thing that I can send you as well. I really was dumbfounded. I was talking to my wife.
What's interesting about that is it's not really on major, I searched for it and it's just all Bitcoin outlets that are reporting it. It's not really on the major news. That's I get it. It's a big deal now.
I'm not much of a conspiracy theorist, except for the fact that I am. But it is very, very, very suspicious that not a single news organization is talking about this. Because this is Iran trying to get around the U.S. This should be everybody's favorite pet story. Because either you love Iran or you hate Iran. And either way, we're going to get out about Iran. But that would legitimize Bitcoin's ability to sidestep the government. And I just don't think the powers that be want that story talked about yet. At least not until after the election. Then they can blame Iran for the election and then throw Bitcoin in there as well. I think prior to that, and I'm not sure exactly, but it was only recently that mining Bitcoin in Iran was even legal. People were doing it illegally. And I think they're finally admitting publicly, yeah, we're doing this so that, we can get food into our country.
Any closing notes?
Buy Bitcoin.
To the moon.
And our other friend is not here to derail our conversation into useful topics about Jesus. So, yeah, let's do this.